I started drawing parallels between how the evangelical marketing machine had made so much money, and probably in the billions at that point, on hate mongering against the LGBT community, raising money against the gay agenda, via direct mail, via the same tools and tactics that the Republican campaign operatives that I worked with would use to raise money for politicians. It was exactly the same thing. And so I started to put these pieces together. There's so much cynicism and so much dissonance going on among the people who work in these industries, and for these people, that these institutions that I had been a part of began to crumble like right before my eyes. Everything. It was like once you see, you cannot unsee.
Taking me too long to recover. I'll go feed the sick and poor and try to help.
Welcome to the Deconstructionist Podcast. I'm your host, John Williamson, and before I get to this week's guest, a few bits of housekeeping. To keep current with everything we're up to, check out our website, www.thedeconstructionists.com. There you can read our blog, link to us on social media, send us an email, and listen to our entire back catalog of episodes. You can also snag a t-shirt or a pint glass on our web store, or if you'd like to support us, you can link to our Patreon page. This week, I welcome Ron Steslow to the podcast. Ron has a remarkable story. Leading up to the 2016 elections, Ron had, by the age of 33, run a $50 million Senate race for the Republican Party, worked for the National Republican Senatorial Committee, led redistricting efforts in Nevada, and started his own consulting firm that boasted clients such as Carly Fiorina. Makes you feel a little lazy if you're the age that I am now. I've done none of that. So anyway, Ron was the feature of the Republican Party. But behind the scenes, Ron was beginning to deconstruct his politics, his faith, and his own vision for his future. So we talked all about his youth as the son of a fundamentalist evangelical preacher, coming out to his parents in his late 20s, and his break from the political party that he seemed destined to help lead. Check out Ron's new podcast, Politicology, available everywhere you find your podcasts. And so without further ado, I give you Ron freaking Steslow.
And I gave you my money so that you would tell me what to think.
You got to do it Joe Rogan style. Boom, and we're live.
I love that. I like it. I don't know if you do you ever listen to Krista Tippett on Being?
I have a few times on Being. I've actually, speaking of running in the same circles and tribes, Padraig's new podcast on Being Network is what I've listened to a lot. I really love him. So
didn't even know he was on.
Yeah. He's doing Poetry Unbound.
Cool.
With in the On Being Network, and it's terrific. It's curated poetry that he reads and then unpacks, and it's beautiful. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I'll have to check that out. But yeah, it reminded me of Krista Tippett does. I don't know if she still does it. She used to release kind of the cleaned up, edited version, and then she would release the one where literally it's them sitting down and like you hear chairs creaking and stuff like that. Anyway.
Yep.
Well, I suppose I should introduce you. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hey, everybody.
Yeah. So before we get too deep, because we've never... I think I told you before we started recording, like we've kind of steered clear of politics, but I've never been in a position to have somebody who literally worked in politics at some of the highest levels, who can talk about it from the inside, and has a very unique religious upbringing as well. And so you are a unique fit for the podcast. So thank you for coming on and all the things that you're going to share, hopefully.
I'm excited to be here and just happy to have a good time. This is I don't do this a lot, and I'm usually on the other side of the conversation asking the questions. So this is gonna be fun for me.
Awesome. Well, so for people who don't know you yet, talk talk a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. My name is Ron Steslow. I host a podcast called Politicology. But before that, I hosted the Lincoln Project podcast, which I co-founded in 2019. And I've spent up to now about 18 years working in high-stakes Republican politics. Just recently made the switch to podcasting media from a very long consulting career. So
that's incredible. And you are a young guy. Like you've been, and they, by the way, I always think it's funny when they say that in articles about people. They point out the age and they're like, look at this whippersnapper, like, cause you're in your mid-30s. Yeah. Like
I say, 18. Yeah, it's been 18 years, but I'm 37, and I've been doing this for that long. Actually, my first, I think I was a sophomore in college when I first started interning, and one thing led to another. That was in 02 or 03, and then the Bush-Cheney 04 campaign was the first major inflection point, and then. I grew up in Nevada, so I worked for a senator there, conservative Republican senator. And I started interning there when I was in college, and then one thing led to another. And before I graduated, they offered me a job on the campaign, so I did that, and then 3 federal campaigns in the same cycle later. The next thing I knew, I had a job offer in Washington, and things just sort of, continued to spiral in the right direction. Although that's not what I intended to do. It was satisfying and exciting, and I was good at it. And then eventually, many campaigns later, and some national work later, I started a consulting firm in DC, and we did pretty well. And then I ran Carly Fiorina's marketing operation in 2015. And then when Donald Trump became the nominee, that was, maybe we can get into this, but that was not the catalyst for a re-examination of my affiliation with the Republican Party. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. At that point, it was the final moment, and that's when I knew I can't do this anymore. I can't be part of this thing. So.
Yeah. Let's dig into that. So before we get into that, though, I think we have to start at the beginning. And so,
sure.
So you said you grew up out west. We're in the Midwest here. We're in the middle of Columbus, Ohio, where it's currently very cool and rainy.
Yeah.
But so what kind of upbringing did you have? Were you raised religious? What kind of upbringing did you experience?
Yeah, I was a PK. My dad was an evangelical pastor. Foursquare, for your listeners who know the denomination. He had a small church in a little town in Nevada, about 30 miles outside of Las Vegas, and I was homeschooled until fourth grade. And yeah, it was a very sort of fundamental, but very loving upbringing, and very conservative. This was, Dr. Dobson, Focus on the Family, Adventures in Odyssey is what we,
yes.
Those were our bedtime stories, right? And it was, honestly, it was a great childhood, up until adolescence. And, when it came time for the birds and the bees talk, I didn't get that talk. Instead I got a copy of Dobson's Preparing for Adolescence left on my pillow. And that was my explanation for everything. And, so yeah, so I, and it was around that time I started realizing I was attracted to guys, and didn't know, what to do with that. It was really scary, really dark, pray every night, God, no, please don't, not this, anything but this, right? That just can't be, don't do this to me. And obviously that didn't work. and it would be a long and pretty tough several years as a tween and then a teenager. And I started to withdraw and become sort of less comfortable in my own skin. And even looking back now, I see photos of myself at that age, and I just, I have so much empathy for that kid because he was just, so uncomfortable with who he was and so sort of desperate to, fight to be something different. And so that really happy, loving childhood turned a corner and became a very sort of dark internal struggle. And the love that I had come to think was unconditional, in fact, wasn't unconditional. And I wasn't experiencing it as unconditional because there were boundaries and who I was feeling to be inside was outside of the boundaries of that love. And so it got tough for a while. And then, but I, pushed it down like a good fundamentalist Christian and moved on, tried to be a straight guy. And it wasn't until much, much later, I was in my mid-late 20s. I was 27 by the time I finally came out to my parents. But by that point, I had already been in a relationship for 3.5 years, totally in the closet. And during that time, after I finished college, so all this is going on in college. I didn't date in college, guys or girls, and I met my first boyfriend as I was graduating, and then that came to an end, 3 or 4 years later. But I was working in Republican politics this entire time. So not only was the fundamentalist sort of indoctrination a major component to that discomfort with my identity, but even who I was working for and among became an extra layer of sort of unacceptance and repression. It was just like I didn't fit in either of these tribes really, but I was very much part of them. And so it wasn't until 27, and I was on a major U.S. Senate campaign in Connecticut, and I got an email that was essentially an anonymous threat to out me.
Whoa!
Not just to the campaign, but to make a problem for my candidate at the time. And this was probably the number one or number two U.S. Senate race at the time. Everybody was watching this race, and while marriage equality wasn't a major issue in that campaign, it hadn't become one yet. I'm pretty sure that my candidate was, if she was asked the question, probably would have either dodged it or said she's for traditional marriage equality. So it could have potentially become an issue. And I was terrified, absolutely terrified at the time. And I just remember getting this email and didn't know who it was from, couldn't figure out who it was from. I tried every method possible to trace it and see like who hates me this much that they would do something like this. And my very first instinct when I couldn't figure it out, I was sitting there sort of in the it was probably 11 o'clock at night in the campaign headquarters. And my first instinct was to call my communications director at the time. Not my parents, not my sister, not, that's the kind of soldier that I was, right?
Oh, man.
call my communications director. I'm like, got to talk. He thinks, somebody died. Are you okay? And like, I just need to talk to you. Like, not in the office. We need to talk.
Yeah.
So I show him the email. I go climb in his pickup truck, show him the email. And I am, to this day, extremely grateful to him for how he handled that, because it was the most exposed, most vulnerable I've ever felt, had ever felt at that point. And he said two things. One, take a deep breath, because this is going to be okay. And number two, if anybody tries to write this story, I'll squash it. And this was a guy who paced up and down the campaign office with a baseball bat over his shoulder while he talked to reporters. So when he says, I'll squash the story, I believed him.
Right.
So
that's amazing.
So yeah. And that was the moment. That was the moment, took a couple days to shake that off. And I decided that I was never going to allow somebody else to have that kind of control over me ever again. Not ever would. Nobody gets to have that kind of power over me, which meant I needed to own who I was, own my story. And that was in September of 2010. And so that Thanksgiving, I flew home. My sister, one of my sisters who was in New Zealand at the time, I told her over Skype, and I got her to agree to come home from New Zealand for Thanksgiving and be there with me when I told our parents, and she did. And that was when I finally came out to my parents. And soon after that, that was a major hurdle, which sort of allowed for me to begin living into a more authentic sense of self. And it was early the following year when I came out to my colleagues, my bosses, and basically told them, like, look, I am prepared to not work for you anymore, if that's what it means, right? But this is who I am, and it's not changing. And that means that I can't work for candidates who, are extremely anti-LGBT. And, I was beginning to merge these two different worlds that I had constructed and sustained for so long. Sorry, I've been going on for a while, but that was a very long answer to a pretty simple question.
No. You covered a lot of ground there that I was very curious about, because I can only imagine it's got to be difficult enough to be dealing with those things behind the scenes and kind of fighting with your own identity in the context of a situation where, you just have one of those components. Like your parents are very conservative politically or conservative theologically, but you have all of these things. And on top of that, your pastor is also your dad, Yeah. So, what kind of, if you're okay sharing, like what kind of response did you initially get from your family? And then what was the response from your coworkers after you kind of made the progression?
Yeah. It's funny. You say my pastor was my dad, because he was, and I remember as a teenager, sort of in some desperate argument, just like yelling, "Can't you just be my dad and not my pastor?"
Oh, wow.
And like, that's a sentiment that really resonates deeply, because I felt it. It was like, and there's, now having been in therapy for, 5 years weekly, which I still love. I go every week because I love it.
Amen.
You can have that's an analyst's field day when you have God and dad wrapped up in the same figure, and, right. So anyway, they, and I should say, in case they're listening to this, I have a great relationship with my parents now. We don't talk as much as we should, and that's on me. But everyone has come a long way since this moment. But
Yeah.
but at that time when I came out to them, it wasn't good. It didn't go great. I distinctly remember the look on my dad's face, which said to me, I was hugging my mom after I on Thanksgiving, right? Of course, because drama and
major holidays. Yes.
Major holiday. Absolutely. I was hugging my mom, looking over her shoulder at my dad. And I just remember this look on his face that to me said, why are you smiling? Because I felt so relieved. I was smiling.
Yeah.
And the look on his face was kind of like, why are you smiling? Like, it was like we'll fix this kind of look, don't we'll fix this. And then when I started smiling, it was like, yeah. And that stuck with me for a long time. And it would be a long time after that until my dad and I could have a real conversation. So, so it didn't go well. My sister, at that point, Kristen, she was my rock. And it continues to be to this day. And I have a great relationship with her and my other sister. And, so on the family side, I had, a couple of siblings who were very supportive. And when I told my bosses, to my surprise, they were also, supportive. And, one of them at the time, I don't work with these people anymore. One of them was an ex-military guy. And I remember him saying to me, I'll defend you to the death.
Wow.
And the other guy was like, first of all, I don't care. And second of all, I knew, and right. And so okay. Those responses, those reactions were they were really surprising to me, because, that was probably when I began to sort of, look very closely at the politics I was engaged in, the candidates I was working for, the dissonance that I had accumulated working in the Republican Party, which had been going further and further in a direction that I found problematic. And that was a sort of a long journey. I mean, that was in 2010, 2011. That's when I started to really unpack things and enter my deconstruction phase. Yeah. Cue the theme music.
I wish we had some,
Yeah. And it was at that time. So let's talk about Rob Bell for a minute. Hi, Rob.
Yeah.
So, because it was at that point that Love Wins came out.
Oh, man. What timing?
Yeah. It was and here's the funny part. Funny. It's poetic, right? So growing up in an evangelical church, during the 90s, my dad was a fan of this really cool, black rim glasses wearing, really hip pastor who was just on the rise. And so showed me all these Numa videos, and I was like, oh, this guy's kind of cool, right? I'm like, okay, whatever, Dad, right? and then so I knew of him, and I'd followed, and the first Everything is Spiritual DVD, right? Yep. Which I thought was really, really cool. And so 2011 rolls around, Love Wins drops while I'm going through all of this, and it was exactly what I needed to read at exactly the right time. And it was almost like, I'm in free fall and I landed in a safety net. It was just like, oh my God, like, okay. It was a huge relief. And that book really started to open things up for me. And I started going deep, and and that's just part of who I am. I've been a naturally curious person. When I was, 13, 14, I was reading Francis Schaeffer's The God Who Is There, He Is There, Not He Is Not, the trilogy, right? And I was like, okay, if I'm going to do this whole like God thing, I'm going to be able to defend it logically, right? So of course I went to the Christian logician to learn about how to make apologetic arguments for the existence of God, right. So Rob's book comes out, and it starts this spiral, a really healthy, I say spiral, it's a very healthy spiral. And I started reading everything I could get my hands on, and especially from writers who were thinking about the scriptures in their ancient historical and cultural context. And it was like I started to wake up. Yeah. It was really like I started to wake up. Then I read Mel White. I think it was Stranger at the Gate.
Okay.
And some of your listeners might be familiar with this. Mel White was Jerry Falwell's ghostwriter. And he tells this story in I think it's in that book about, first of all, coming out to Jerry Falwell, and Jerry Falwell basically saying, okay, so when can you write my next book? And put that as like example number 2 of cynicism and dissonance that I was starting to pick up on, right? And then he tells another story about how they were riding in a car together on a way to a speech that Jerry was giving, and they're in the backseat of his car, and there's LGBT protests outside of where he was going to speak. And Jerry turns to Mel and says, Mel, if the gays didn't exist, I'd have to invent them.
Wow.
Then, after reading that story, I started learning about all of the money that I started drawing parallels between how the evangelical marketing machine had made so much money, and probably in the billions at that point, on hate mongering against the LGBT community, raising money against the gay agenda, via direct mail, via the same tools and tactics that the Republican campaign operatives that I worked with would use to raise money for politicians. It was exactly the same thing. And so I started to put these pieces together. There's so much cynicism and so much dissonance going on among the people who work in these industries, and for these people, that these institutions that I had been a part of began to crumble like right before my eyes. Everything, it was like once you see, you cannot unsee, right?
Yeah.
And so I read a lot of stuff, and I started breaking everything down. By this point, I was not going to church. I was not even interested, and I hadn't been for a long time up to that point, because I had put God and faith in general into a box in a closet and just didn't open it, because I don't want to go in there, because didn't feel good.
Yeah.
And so these worlds merging and reconciling with one another and with self required opening that box and really looking closely at what was in it. And so that was the start of my deconstruction. And then when all of that started to fall apart, I started looking very closely at, what does this mean, right? So what do I do now? Like, okay, then I stumbled across the Reformation Project, which is a terrific organization doing great work. Matthew is doing great work advocating for LGBT inclusion within evangelical communities. And I think that work really needs to be done, taking a high view of Scripture, because it can be done. But, I don't belong there anymore. I don't identify. It is still my heritage, and I feel like there are lots of people who can be helped by that work.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
From a policy perspective, from a political advocacy perspective, there are lots of people trying to do progressive work in advancing LGBT equality at the state level now that most of the work is done at the federal level. The state level now is where most of it needs to be done. But what they run into in trying to advocate for more inclusive policies at the state level is ultimately religious caucus leaders in the Republican Party.
Yes.
And so conversations about the merits of inclusive policies ultimately at that level do not hinge on the merits of the policy or the constitutionality. They ultimately hinge on conversations about faith. That when you sit down with a state legislator who's about to make a decision on whether or not transgender women and girls should be allowed to play in sports, in high school sports, those conversations ultimately devolve into, well, the Bible says this or God says this. And so the advocates at that level have learned that you have to be able to have theological conversations, and you have to be able to at least, the very brave ones like Matthew will take a high view of Scripture and try to advocate at that level. But most of those legislators either aren't interested or aren't capable of having a conversation at that level about theology. And so ultimately it comes down to how good are you at dialogue and how good are you at interpersonal persuasion. So, wow, I think we're on a tangent. I don't know how we got here.
This is beautiful. Yeah.
So that's deconstruction. I started to, and then I found Pete Rollins. I'm sure your listeners love. You just had him on recently.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
not too long ago.
Atheism for Lent.
Yeah.
Yep.
Atheism for Lent. Right. I went to my first wake in that would be 17, 19, 20. This would be my fourth. So it must have been 16 or 17 was my first wake. And this is going somewhere, by the way. All of this culminated, all of this deconstruction, and God, I don't believe any of this stuff anymore. My politics are deconstructing. My whole worldview is changing, and I was trying to figure out how to be and who to be in the same skin. And I didn't believe anymore. I had long since abandoned any belief in the old white, God on a cloud with a beard in the sky, right? All of that was gone for me. All of that was dead for me. And I went to Wake, and I don't remember what the theme was that year, but I remember there was lots of Nietzsche. There was lots of Derrida, lots of sort of existential philosophy, and I remember after the first or second night, there was a lot of death of God philosophy there, and I remember there was the first or second night, and I was laying in bed in my hotel room, and I was just staring at the ceiling, pitch black. And I just started to sob. I just started to cry. And I wasn't sad. I wasn't, despairing. It was joy. It was relief. It was joy. But it was like what happened that year, what happened at that moment was God had died for me intellectually, in my head. But that reality moved from my head into my body, and I finally let go. Like my body was letting go of all of that. And that was a very big moment. And it was after that I, and by that point I had already left the party. I'd already sort of disidentified as a Republican because that was after Trump, it was that was a major turning point for me. And so after that is when I started to look at, okay, how am I going to realign what I'm doing in the world with who I know I am and what I know I value. And that's when the really satisfying work began.
Yeah. Gosh, and you got right into the territory where I kind of wanted to go anyway, which is, we've talked about this on the podcast before. There's this very strange kind of interweaving between conservative religion, conservative Christianity specifically, and conservative politics, and it's almost you can't have one without the other at this point, which is not the case for for example, the Democratic Party. There's not this kind of strange bedfellow situation happening there. And so it's kind of interesting. Yeah. So you did mention the fact that, you have to be prepared to have some sort of those theological discussions. Yeah. And yet, it's, I don't know. It's difficult. We've had a lot of conversations about this in the sense that it seems to have devolved in the situation where it's been used as a tool. You have these single issues that the Republican Party, to great success, has been able to get millions and millions of people to vote a certain way based off of one single issue, whether it's abortion or gay marriage or whatever the case might be, where that is not, so when you started to see these types of things, obviously you had a moment, a conscience, a crisis of conscience, and not everyone has had that, but I think it really kind of came to fruition within the last election cycle or two. Obviously, since Trump came about, you started to see people say, wait a minute, something's wrong here. Something's very broken. Mm-hmm. But not everybody. There's still a overwhelming majority of white evangelical Christians still, after everything that we saw over the past handful of years, still cast their vote for an individual who, in my opinion, my personal opinion, could not be more of the antithesis of, Jesus in the New Testament. So from somebody, who has worked on the inside of politics, and you started to see kind of this weird marriage between the two, is that something that can even be fixed at this point? I mean, obviously this was decades in the making. This didn't happen overnight.
Yeah. Can it be fixed? That's the question of the hour, isn't it? So let's, there's a lot in there. Okay. So for one thing, I think, first of all, the segment of white Christians, and they're mostly evangelicals, who didn't see anything wrong with Trump and actually still don't see anything wrong with Trump. I would argue, and maybe this is controversial, I'm sure it's controversial, that that comes from a very, very flimsy faith. Mm. If you are justifying your support of a man like Donald Trump, it has nothing to do with either Christianity or conservatism. Mm. It's actually cultural, and it's actually fear-based. Because Donald Trump was not and is not a conservative. He never was. And I mean small c conservative. He doesn't believe in smaller government. He doesn't believe in any of the classically conservative things that the Republican Party used to stand for. But that's a completely different conversation.
Yeah. Well, explain that first too, actually, because I think that's important. Sure. Like there is a very big difference between what the Republican Party kind of stands for now versus, we talk about Eisenhower Republicans or even Reagan Republicans. Yeah. There's a big difference. Yeah.
There's a big difference. I mean, family values, taxing and spending, big government. And by the way, so Donald Trump's tax cuts, one of the largest tax cuts in history, mostly benefiting corporations and the wealthy, and tax cuts. Everybody, your listeners should understand. They need to be understood as spending bills. because that's essentially what the government is doing. It's spending more money and it's giving it to certain people and organizations. It comes off of the balance sheet of the federal government, and that was one of the biggest spending projects in recent history. Republicans, I learned through my deconstructing process, right? All the things that I thought were really grounded in a small c conservative ideology that emphasized individual liberty and responsibility, and those two things have to always go hand in hand. Those things didn't really matter to most of the voters and even most of the officials that they elected. When you go back and look at the co-opting of the church, the moral majority in the 80s, before Ronald Reagan, the Republican Party realized it was never going to win a national election ever again. And that was because the South was Democrat for the most part. And so they concocted this plan to co-opt the church and the issues of homosexuality and abortion in particular in order to peel off white Democrats in the South to become Republicans. And it worked. But those two issues, that co-opting of the church in order to win the South so that they could carry a national election again, they had nothing to do with conservative philosophy. They had nothing to do with anything principled. They were purely a cynical electoral calculation to move people from one side of the tally to the other. And what happened was the co-opting the church and then the emphasis on these social cultural issues, they became enshrined as gospel, essentially, a Republican gospel. They became part of the platform, and that platform is often just taken for granted as being a conservative platform by most of the rank and file membership of the Republican Party. So you fast forward to 2004, and George W. Bush is on the ballot, and you know what Ken Mellman, who was then the chairman of the Republican Party at the time, did? Helped to orchestrate putting ballot initiatives in many of the key swing states that Bush needed to win in that election that would have put constitutional amendments at the state level banning gay marriage.
Whoa!
They used the anti-gay sentiment, particularly among evangelical voters, to turn out Republicans who would then ultimately vote for Bush. But it was a turnout mechanism. So, this is, coming back to your question about, conservatism versus republicanism. The conservatism is a coherent ideology about how a society ought to function. And you can take it or leave it, but it has merit to it, right? It's thought out, it's principled, it's consistent. It's a way of seeing the world that's coherent. The Republican Party is purely an electoral machine. That's what it exists to do. And when I realized that ultimately winning was all that mattered, all that ever mattered, that's when I knew I couldn't be a part of it anymore. Not because I was this hardcore, conservative, but I believed that in the things that I thought were right, that generally, individual freedom and personal responsibility are good values. All of that was it was a lie. It was made up in order to win elections. So that was the culmination of leaving the party behind, because it wasn't true, it wasn't real, and the seeking of power, which is now on full display with no apologies, right? Donald Trump essentially was the culmination of all of that. He was not an aberration in Republican politics. He is the natural conclusion. He's the product of 20, 30, 40 years of Republican politics. So that's why I say that was the straw that broke the camel's back, because he was the embodiment of the fact that the Republican Party actually only ever cared about winning. It was all about the pursuit and preservation of power at all costs. So and now there's no apology for that. That's exactly what you see on full display. So
and that's the most remarkable part. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the most remarkable part to me is there is this unabashed, just out in the open, just win at all costs, and we will court whoever we need to court, just simply for votes. Even, I mean, I never thought I'd see the day where a president did not speak out against something like white supremacy. Never thought I'd see the day. Because it's like, those are voters. They do vote, and it's like, oh my gosh, like the things that I never thought I'd see. Or like one of the things I want to ask you about too.
Militarized white supremacy group.
Yes.
Stand back and stand by.
January 6th, the insurrection of the Capitol.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Unbelievable. And so it seems like, and this is what I want to get your take on, is that they've taken kind of, as you said, this mechanism that they use to win elections, and they've taken it to the next logical level, to the extent now where for the past 4 or 5 years, any news source or any voice that speaks to the contrary has been demonized as the enemy. Literally, the media is the enemy, and so CNN's bad, MSNBC's bad. Like all of these are bad. And certain terms are even politicized or demonized now. Like so, there's a visceral response that you get from people just by hearing the words like progressive or conservative or liberal or green. Now green's a bad word. So, what's interesting to me is I would wager to guess that most people, when pressed, could not define any of those terms in an adequate sense.
Oh, of course not. No.
Yeah.
But they don't need to. They're never asked to. They're only meant to elicit a fear response. You're totally right. But I think ultimately, I mean, if there's a glimmer of hope here, I think ultimately it's that maybe it's not so hopeful. First of all, it's going to get worse before it gets better. Let's just put that on the table, right? The next 20 years in America are going to be not so good for democracy. We're in a fight. Yeah. But the good news here is, and we're not in a fight over policy. That's the remarkable part. I never thought I would see the day when democracy would essentially be on the ballot, when the very system that we use to organize ourselves is up for debate. That a free and pluralistic society is something that we might not want, and that's what one significant portion. That's what one major party is actually arguing now, and not just arguing, but scaring people into believing. So, the glimmer of hope here is that core base of voters is shrinking. That a campaign against the right to vote is ultimately a losing battle. That doesn't mean they're not going to have some victories along the way. And in fact, there are bills moving through state legislatures all around the country right now, just like the Georgia bill that just passed and was signed into law, trying to make it harder to participate in democratic government, small d democratic government, trying to make it harder to vote, trying to make it harder to register to vote, trying to make it harder to to get to the polls. And they're doing all of this because when you can't argue successfully for your policy positions, for your ideas about how to move America forward, the only thing you can do, and when you can't do that because it's a losing argument, because most of the country disagrees with you, you have to limit who can vote. That's the only play they have, to shut more people out of the process because they're overwhelmingly in the minority. Those views are overwhelmingly in the minority. So ultimately, that just speaks to the weakness of the policy preferences among the base of the Republican Party. But they also control state legislatures for the most part, which means we're in a real fight for the future of American democracy. It's going to be the defining fight, I think, of the next 10 to 20 years.
Wow. So I want to get your take on this, and I'm certainly, I dabble in politics. I was a history major, so I had to take some poli-sci courses, and I always found it interesting. But even as a kid, I remember learning just the basics, your basic civics.
Yeah.
And I remember learning about, for example, gerrymandering, and thinking to myself, how the hell is that legal? You're literally redrawing the political map so you can include only the people who would vote for you. And you get this political map that looks like an amoeba. How is that in 2021 still a legal practice? And then the other problem that seems to be kind of fueling the candidates that we even get at the end is just money. Just these vast, absurd amounts of money that it just seems to me like the candidates who can spend the most money are the ones who are there at the end. Is that an accurate
Well, partially it is, but ultimately, I think what you're expressing is the frustration with the shitty candidates. I don't know if I can say that on your podcast.
You can say shitty.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. No.
Okay.
They are
the shitty candidates
candidates
that you get at the general election, right at the very end, right after all the primaries, because the primaries are closed, meaning. Right. With closed primaries and heavily gerrymandered districts, what you end up with is a race to the fringes of each party because each one is trying to be the purest possible candidate for their party. So in a closed primary, only people in that party get to vote. So if there are 2 candidates, 3 candidates, or 4 in a Republican primary, guess who votes in a Republican primary? The most animated of Republican voters. Guess who they vote for? The craziest candidates, the ones who are just as animated and vocal as they are. And those people tend to be extreme. And so those people tend to win primaries. So this is how you end up with, with Marjorie Taylor Greene on a ballot. It's because so it's closed primaries combined with heavily gerrymandered districts, and the Supreme Court has recently kicked back a case last year saying that you can't ban partisan data from redistricting processes. We're doing a whole series of this on Politicology, which completely makes sense. You can't essentially, speaking as someone who's actually drawn the lines, I did that in Nevada in 2011, actually. It is essentially impossible not to consider the partisan composition of the states you're drawing, but we actually just did this whole episode on the Voting Rights Act, which is where what Republicans have used to great success in order to draw gerrymandered districts that ultimately pass in the litigation that follows, that they're upheld. It's a major problem that is not easy to solve. Gerrymandering itself is not an easy problem to solve, especially considering that places like Georgia, for example, which until just a few years ago had to run all of its voting-related laws, including new district boundaries for congressional and state legislative districts, by the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., essentially asking for permission to do that, because they have such a history of disenfranchising minority voters, right? So that was a thing called preclearance. So that was recently struck down and is no longer required. And so this will be the first decade, first redistricting that, for example, states in the South, which were usually covered, like Georgia, will not have to ask for permission to change those boundaries. So, and Republicans increasingly are showing less and less shame when it comes to exploiting minority communities in order to draw an advantage on the map for themselves. So, those are the two big factors driving the disproportional advantage that they have, both in state legislatures and in the House.
Man, I just think I remember it wasn't so bad, I guess, this last election, but I remember maybe it was the last election or the last term for Obama. I just remember receiving so much in the way of like pamphlets and just like the amount of fire kindling that I got that year.
Yep.
And the amount of political ads. It was like every commercial was a political ad. It was absurd. Yeah. And the amount of money that's just spent on these types of campaigns, it just seems like, in a country that still, for some strange reason, thinks it's a multi-party system, which is absurd. Yeah. We're a two-party system. Let's be real.
We're a two-party system. Yeah.
Yeah.
A multi-party system would be fascinating in America, and I'd love to see us move in that direction. To have the benefits of a constitutional system with the benefits of a parliamentary system, where you actually have to build coalitions in order to get something done, that'd be very interesting to see.
And wouldn't that really solve the problem? Because really, at the end of the day, aren't most people more moderate than anything, right? Like for example, I could say I can get on board with a lot of conservative policy in terms of, where we spend our money and how much we spend and spending it, responsibly. But then socially, the Democratic Party is really the only option for me, because I'm for things like gay marriage and I'm, and healthcare for all and things like that. But there's not a party available that kind of splits the middle, right? Like, isn't that where an independent party would be perfect? But how do they compete with the just fundraising machines of the established, two big ones?
Yeah. So, This is a great question, and I actually worked on this for a few years, trying to crack that nut with a project called the Serve America Movement, SAM, and it was basically an effort to create a new national party that didn't essentially have a platform based on policy, but rather on problem solving and local service, right? Service to the constituents, and so I really went deep into the independent and reform space, and there's some great people doing really important work in that space, like trying to pass reform measures like open primaries and ranked choice voting, which essentially gives you the option to rank all of the candidates on your ballot in order of preference as opposed to just picking one, because that would essentially do away with, at least in theory, would do away with all of the extreme candidates winning. But in order to become a party, there are enormous barriers, and it's a 50-state patchwork of laws in order to become a major national political party. And anywhere from just sign this piece of paper, but then you have to win a certain threshold of votes in a major election, to you have to pay enormous six-figure sums just to register as a party. The two existing parties have made it virtually impossible for that to ever happen.
Oh, sure.
And so so it's really difficult to see how that will happen before before we're able to solve some of the other problems like gerrymandering and close primaries. But yeah, you're right. I think, but here's what's really interesting: the two parties, excuse me, the two parties that do exist are both going through really interesting composition transitions. So the Republican Party is shedding voters like crazy. It's shrinking. And so when you used to hear Donald Trump say things like, "Oh, we have a 95 or 98% approval rating among Republicans," what he isn't telling you is that the pie of Republican voters had shrunk about 10% since he became president. So yeah, sure, maybe you have a 95% approval rating, but there are 10% fewer people because they've left because they don't like you, right? Because you've taken this party into a direction that these people don't want to go to. So it's continually shedding voters. And guess where they're going? Some of them are independents. Some of them are switching to Democrats. So now the Democratic Party is increasingly white-collar workers. And so now you have this very interesting and increasingly tenuous situation within the Democratic Party, where the big tech companies are increasingly Democratic, but and it's the Republicans who want to break up big corporations now, right? So Republicans are now trying to spin themselves as the blue-collar party, the working man's party, which has been traditionally been the territory of the Democratic Party. So what you have is this positional rotation between the two, where people are leaving one for the other, and then you also have the Obama-Trump voters, right? Because there are a lot of them. So increasingly, the Republican Party wants to be the party of the working man, and the Democratic Party is taking on these socioeconomically better off and white collar workers, which is creating different pressure mechanisms within that party. So the two options are themselves evolving, and this is a much longer conversation, but what is the future of the Republican Party is something everybody wants to know. But and I think a lot of it is going to hinge on, like, if we make democracy the defining fight of the next 10, 20 years, that's a winning fight. It's still a fight, but that is one currently the Republican Party is fighting against. And so I see that as a way to accelerate its descent. Let's put it that way. So no new major party on the horizon for sure. But the two parties themselves are changing, and the changing composition is going to change their policy preferences and the things that they're advocating for. And so, for me, I didn't register with the Democratic Party when I left. I registered as an independent, although much of where I think we should go aligns with mainstream Democratic politics. But it's because of this party situation that I've observed that I don't feel like I need to, jump out of one boat into the other, because I think the party system itself is flawed, although it's what we have. I'd like to see more parties, so that we can see coalitions between parties to build majorities that move us forward.
Yeah, it seems like the other part of this is, aside from just presidential candidates and that sort of thing, is just this congressional deadlock that we see as well. And any kind of policy that's ever going to happen, it seems almost like we are stuck in this situation now where you have to have full control, the House and the Senate, in order for anything to get done. Because if you lose control of one, it almost seems like you're just going to see years of just gridlock.
Yeah. And I think this goes back to your point about gerrymandering and the House no longer being representative. really of the popular vote, but also it's no longer responsive to the inputs of its constituents, right? Americans are, by and large, massively in favor of a handful of policies, like take background checks, for example, which still hasn't moved.
Unreal.
Massively in favor, right? And yet, the body that is supposed to be responsive to the inputs of its key stakeholders, its constituents, has not moved a muscle on an overwhelmingly popular policy. So what do we do? This is I think this is part of why there's so much anger and so much frustration with institutions in general. But now you see this debate happening within the Democratic Party about whether or not they should break the filibuster. But guess what? Joe Biden has not signaled support for breaking the filibuster in order to get something like that done. Everyone's sitting here speculating over what will the issue be that finally causes them to break the filibuster, use the impossibly narrow margin that they have in the Senate that is temporary,
right?
In order to get something done. And who knows, maybe it'll be immigration reform. Maybe that feels like the right thing, right? Because we've been fighting about it for 20 years and both parties love fighting about immigration reform. It's more profitable to fight about it than it is to solve it. And I think that's another dimension to the problem. I don't have an answer other than, you're right. And there are a lot of reasons for it. It's very calcified. I think the only answer really is, for me, short term, is to elect as many Democrats as possible. But ultimately, you need reforms in order to make the system more responsive.
Yeah,
those are just harder to get to.
Yeah, because it seems like that natural built-in checks and balances that technically would exist if you had differing parties that could actually work together is just gone. Yeah. At this point, it's like, whatever you guys put on the table, because you guys suggested it, then I'm not doing it. I'm not supporting that.
That's exactly right.
It's just very childhood. Totally right.
It's all positional now.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it's positional. There's very little debate anymore that goes on around how to solve America's toughest problems. It doesn't happen because so many reasons. Because there are no incentives to do that. All of the incentives drive individual actors and organizational actors in the opposite direction. The way information moves now is so much faster than it used to be in the age of bipartisanship. The media environment is in itself an escalating mechanism, right? So it loves ratings. And we know that outrage drives ratings, and so he who shouts the loudest makes the most money in the email inbox, right? When you're raising money, and also so does the network because people flock to that. So you have this really twisted ecosystem that rewards the worst things. The stuff that we don't want in the system, and it's so systemic. It's really difficult to see how any of that changes unless, Mike Madrid actually has some really interesting thoughts on how he comes on Politicology quite a lot. He's one of my fellow co-founders at the Lincoln Project, although we both left in December. He talks about how potentially moving closer to a something that satisfies the populist sentiment among Republicans, almost like more direct democracy. Because he and I've had long conversations about this. How everything's on demand for us these days.
Right.
Everything's on demand. I mean, from from food to laundry to transportation to sex if you want it, to everything is on demand, except the government.
Right.
except Congress, except this system we've set up in order to govern ourselves. It's the most antiquated, frustrating experience, and it does feel like it's due for an update. American-style representative democracy was designed to be slow and deliberative. And we're now in an age when nothing we do is slow and deliberative.
That's true.
I very, very little. And I think there's a really inherent tension in that. I don't, obviously that's not an argument for changing the structure of American government, but it is something worth thinking about how we can make it more responsive and more quickly responsive. Without being reckless. So I don't know. I'd love to hear more ideas on that front. I think it's really interesting. I think it is real. I think the problem is real, and I think that is a major factor. But I don't know what exactly the solution would be.
Yeah. I think this is a great segue into, because I know we're running short on time, but I would be remiss if we didn't talk about your podcast, Politicology. What I think is fascinating about this is I'm very much I will say and call out social media and media in general as a problem when it is a problem, and it often is a problem. We can look back to prior elections where Facebook was essentially used as a tool by our enemies, to propagate misinformation and things like that. But what's interesting to me though is the solution almost seems to be the same thing though, where there's, you know what I mean? Like we can also use it for good. And there are things like podcasts out there that, podcasts didn't exist, 2 decades ago.
Yeah.
But now we have podcasts with very educated, folks like yourself who have a gift for explaining, the system in a way that makes sense to the average Joe like myself, and so I think, the work that you're doing, I think, is massively important, especially now. So tell the listeners a little bit about why you started the podcast and what is the agenda here? What's the motivation?
Yeah. Thank you. Although mostly it's my guests who get to explain to the listeners how things work and sound brilliant all the time. I started the podcast under the Lincoln Project because we needed to do something different than just the negative ads that were bashing Trump, and those served a purpose, absolutely, but ultimately. It was part of our voter contact effort. And when I say voter contact, that's lingo in political campaigns for we're reaching out to persuadable voters who we think we can move in some way. And so what we knew was we needed to create permission structures for people who were Republicans that we needed to vote against Donald Trump. And that meant telling stories, featuring stories about people who had done the same thing, and telling them why. And the Lincoln Project as an organization served that purpose because we were all former Republicans. Some of the founders, I think everybody's pretty much left the party behind, but I won't speak for them individually. It was very powerful, I think, for people to see a whole bunch of consultants and operatives who'd worked in and for the highest level politicians in the country stand up and say, no more. We're going to fight against them this time. This one guy, we're going to take him down. And so we created these permission structures by talking about why, and gave people an opportunity after they'd seen the ads and were curious about why this group of people would do this, to listen to podcasts that explained a lot more about about the journey to get to this moment, what it took to stand up and say no, why Donald Trump needs to be defeated, and why we all feel so strongly about that we've staked our reputations on it and walked away. And so we had really long form conversations, a couple of with former with people who'd switched their votes from Trump to Biden, but also conversations that really put more meat on the bone to that argument for people who were really serious about it. So that was. And it worked, actually. What happened was the Democrats who loved the Lincoln Project would then share the podcast episodes with their conservative family members who they really couldn't have constructive conversations with, and then we started receiving this deluge of emails about how this person switched their vote because they really absorbed this information. They listened to hours of this, and it worked. So through this process, I realized first of all, I really enjoy this because I'm naturally curious and I love asking these questions, and it was meaningful and important, that part of the work. So when I left, I knew I want to keep doing this in some way. But now that Trump is gone, what do we do? Okay, we won that battle really narrowly, barely. And now he's gone. But Trumpism is not gone. In fact, it's very much alive and well. And it's on full display, and it's getting worse. And you see this in the Republican Party now. And so what does it look like to continue this conversation with the people who've been along for the ride and more? And what we decided was, it's part of what led us to Donald Trump was, I think, a desperately weakened civic immune system. We were not prepared for an authoritarian to take the White House. As a country, as an electorate, we weren't prepared for that. And it's because it's never happened before. We've had it good in that has never been a threat that America has faced. We always thought it couldn't happen here. Well, it did. And I think part of our task moving forward is to build a foundation, build up that immune system so that we recognize threats to democracy in the future. That means beginning to recognize that politics is so much bigger than voting every 2 years, than a campaign that lasts for 6 or 8 months, and television ads and crazy candidates. It's so much bigger than that, and that actually politics is embedded in every part of your life, whether you realize it or not, and you bump up against it every single day, multiple times a day, and part of what Politicology is doing is drawing those connections between things that we don't think of as political and how they are political. So we just did this episode on sports. We're doing this with psychology. We're doing this we're going to do this with anthropology. There are so many ways to intersect politics with seemingly unrelated disciplines. And it's by flexing that muscle, by beginning to see that actually everything really is political, and that by saying, oh, I'm just not into politics, or I'm just not a very political person, that's actually, well, first of all, it's not true, but also that actually comes, well, and I can understand the sentiment, the emotion of being exhausted by it. It actually comes from a place of privilege to be able to say that, because politics affects everybody,
yes,
everything. And so Politicology is an effort to draw those connections more deeply, to help people see a bigger picture, and most importantly, to see their role in it. because it isn't just for politicians and political operatives and a different class of people who get to do that for a living. It is inherently everybody's job if we're going to move forward together and if we're going to avoid certain catastrophe like another Donald Trump, a more capable Donald Trump. In order to avoid that, we have to do the work now. And that means becoming more engaged, more aware, and more ready to participate in the process. And so that's what we're doing at Politicology, and then some. But that's the sort of energizing motivation. So we're having lots of conversations. We do a weekly roundup every Friday where we discuss the most important news stories with a rotating panel, and then we'll do a long form interview with a special guest, and those come out on Wednesdays. So.
Oh, that's fantastic. It's funny because I think I draw a connection to the work that we do in the sense that I've always viewed it as just helping out with people's ignorance. And I don't mean that in a mean way.
Yeah.
I just think,
of course.
I just think it's easy to go on autopilot when it comes to religion, when it comes to politics, especially when things are going well. And at some point, though, you have to kind of open your eyes and do the work. And I think part of it is just people just don't know. Like, we talk about theological concepts like atonement theory, things like that. Yeah. And people just take it for granted that is the only viewpoint, know? And I think it's very true especially true with politics. It's amazing how little the average voter knows about how the political process even works, and maybe we could get into a much longer conversation about the education system or whatever, but
oh man, civic education, that's another conversation, but yes, absolutely.
Yes. I think educating people, and I think it's so easily accessible now, especially through the podcast medium, and it's free, and it's like I said, it's easily accessible. Anybody can pick it up and listen to it, and it's free education out there.
Totally.
And so keep up the great work. I love it. This was such a fun conversation for me to have. I was geeking out a little bit. I don't get to talk politics very often. So
no, this is great, man. This is really fun, and really fun for me too, because I don't, usually, like I said, I'm asking the questions. So this is fun. I hope I didn't talk too long.
No, this is great. This is great. I loved it. And I think it's fun too, because, like I said, we don't get to talk about politics very often, and to have somebody who can come on and kind of break down what these things actually mean, you threw out the idea of, closed primaries, I didn't even know, and I consider myself fairly informed. I just show up and vote, that was even a thing until this last election cycle, and I'm a 41-year-old man. So, like, if I didn't know that, I'm sure there's a whole host of other things I don't know, and a whole bunch of things that the average, citizen probably isn't aware of. So,
yeah, totally. You're definitely not alone.
Well, thank you so much. This is so fun.
Really fun.
We'll have to do it again sometime, and we can go even deeper. So,
absolutely, I'd like that. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks.
John, thank you so much.
Oh, before I let you go, oh my gosh, tell people where they can go to fund the podcast and to stay up on top of everything that you're up to.
Yeah, sure. You can find Politicology on Apple, Spotify, Google, everywhere you get your podcasts. It's Politicology, Politicology. And we have a website, politicology.com. And I'm generally on Twitter. Twitter and Instagram is the really only ones I use. I'm at Ron Steslow on Twitter, and I think at Politicology Pod on Twitter. So.
Yes, I can confirm this. I follow both, so yes. Cool. Yeah, awesome, man. Thank you so much. Awesome. This is a ton of fun.
Yeah, I feel like we've got a lot of geeking out to do, so we should get together in person sometime when the stars align.
I would love that. Now that we're all fully vaccinated. So.
Yeah, right. Get vaccinated, everybody.
That's right. Please. I'd like to go to concerts again. That would be wonderful.
I just want to go to a real wake again. So.
Yes. Oh, I keep promising Pete every year. I'm like, I'm coming to Ireland, man. I'm doing it this year.
Do it.
I need to. And then the pandemic hit, and I'm like, well, now I can't.
I know. Maybe we'll meet at Wake next year. Actually,
that'd be amazing.
That'd be cool. Yeah, that'd be pretty cool.
Oh, thanks.
All right.
Thanks so much, man. Really appreciate it.
Talk to you later.
All right.
Does God have a face? Does he have a body or even a name? If he does she know that I'm alive? Is God even here? Does she care that I doubt? Does she care that I fear? Something tells me God will survive. Take a breath, breathe it in. The mystery that is this, a universe we don't know, but I think the truth is, if God has a face, then his face must look like yours. Did God kill his kid? Did he have to have blood before he could forgive? Maybe we made a God to look like us. Does God know my name? Is the ache in my soul just confined to my brain? Even so, does that mean it's not real? Take a breath, breathe it in. The mystery that is this, a universe we don't know, but I think the truth is, if God has a face, then her face must look like yours. A face like a Tina, an Ahmed or Mildred, or Russ and his husband, Gus and their children. A face like a Kim, a Ted or Tyrone, a Lucy born with an extra chromosome, a Pablo with legs he can't move by himself, a girl born a Daniel who now is Danielle, a Bill H. and Yee, even white guys named Todd. If you have a heartbeat, you are the face of God. So take a breath, breathe it in. The mystery that is this, a universe we don't know, but I think the truth is, if God has a face, then her face face must look. If God has a face, his face must look. If God has a face, their face it must be yours.
Why choose a Sleep Number smart bed?
Can I make my side softer?
Can I make my side firmer? Can we sleep cooler?
Sleep Number does that. Cools up to 8 times faster and lets you choose your ideal comfort on either side. Your Sleep Number setting. And now, during our Black Friday sale, save 50% on the Sleep Number limited edition smart bed. Plus free home delivery when you add a base. And Cyber Monday. To find a store near you, visit sleepnumber.com.